We're into our second hour now.
We work with peasants, some of them, don't we? Their musical taste is in their mouth. It's time for the news.
Jennifer Kite.
Not you, Jen. Morning, Jen.
Good morning, guys. Good morning, everyone. The jury in the Oklahoma bombing trial must now decide if it will put Timothy McVeigh to death after finding him guilty of mass murder this morning. Jurors agreed with the prosecution that McVeigh used a massive bomb to kill 168 people, 19 of them young children.
That's right. We got him!
Victims' families could not control their emotion as they left the Denver court straight after the verdict was read. In contrast, Timothy McVeigh sat showing no emotion, just looking at his watch. He was found guilty of 11 charges relating to the bombing, which killed 168 people. Victims' relatives had been concerned because the jury had taken almost 24 hours to deliberate over 4 days. Now they say their ordeal is over. Does it ease some of the pain for you?
Somewhat. Now I think I might be able to sleep a little bit easier and a little bit more than I have in the past 2 years.
The importance of this verdict, too, to average Americans was illustrated by the cheering crowd out the front of the court. As the prosecutors returned to their offices in Denver, they received applause from onlookers. In Oklahoma City itself, a celebration has begun. The same jury...
Can we start with you? This was to be a routine medical flight, if I can call it that way. You took off from King Island at about 5 o'clock Saturday. You were flying for Wynyard. How long does that flight normally take, and how far into the flight did you know that it wasn't going to be a routine one?
Steve, it's about a 22 or 23-minute flight to Wynyard, and all had gone very normally until arrival at Wynyard. Selected gear down for a normal landing, and of course the gear didn't come down. Okay, so at that point, when you realised that the automatic landing gear and the manually operated landing gear isn't going to work, you decide to head for Launceston. It's not quite correct, Steve. At that stage, we'd only tried the normal landing gear. Steve and I both assessed the situation and made our initial checks in flight. And then we made a decision to divert to Launceston. And it was on arrival at Launceston that we intended to deploy the emergency manual extension. All right, now I'll come to the double problem in just a moment. But Steve, at what point did Tim, who's sitting at the controls of the plane, tell you that there was a problem, or did he not have to tell you? You just became aware of it?
We did speak about it prior to, well, just before arriving at Wynyard, and then prior to approaching Launceston, obviously when Tim tried the manual override that didn't work, that's when we discussed it. Okay, yeah. And how did your patient, the young woman with the broken arm and her mother who's accompanying her on the flight, how did they react when it became apparent to them that this wasn't going to be a normal landing? Well, when we approached Wynyard and initially had the problem, I did explain to them the situation and not to worry because we had a manual override, so it wasn't a problem at all. Then I had to explain that, in fact, that wasn't working, but not to worry because we were going to do something. And the something you did, how did they react? I mean, you're sitting there reassuring them, Tim's at the controls of the plane, and you start pulling up the floor and part of the King Air's bulkhead. They didn't say very much at all. They knew exactly what I was doing, as I did explain, and I obviously had to look after the patient at the same time. But they didn't have... You got your hands full. Well, I did, but they didn't have a lot to say, but they stayed very calm, which was great. And Tim, because while all this is going on, there's not a great deal you can do, because you've got to stay at the controls of the plane. It's probably a little bit like that, Steve. However, we were quite busy liaising with the main base of our Royal Flying Doctor Service and terrific team efforts of the ground support crew behind us. Because if I can interrupt there, they had to find an engineer who subsequently could communicate with you guys on a mobile phone. That's correct. Our communications commitment on board is terrific equipment with mobile phones, and through Broken Hill Base and also locating engineers in Sydney, we were able to work through the problem. Now, Tim, what are the odds of the automatic landing gear mechanism and the manual mechanism both failing? Yeah, Steve, you've probably got a good point there. It's your normal extension is very, very reliable, and if you consider the relative odds of that not happening for you in the first instance is quite remote, and then to multiply that with the odds of the emergency system failing is makes it a
a really, really remote thing that happened to us, yeah.
And Steve, talking of odds, you're playing them, aren't you? Because this has happened to you before.
It happened to me once before in 1983 in Hobart, yes, in a different plane altogether.
But the same sort of problem?
Same scenario. I had to do some different things on that occasion. It wasn't the floor, it was part of the dashboard.
And Tim, you've been flying for what, 9 or more years now. Is this the first time something like this has happened to you?
Steve, probably to this extent we're running through the procedures that we have. You normally get a favourable result, but at this stage our published procedures had come to an end, because normally here we would have had a manual extension and landing. So
you mean
now,
you ran out of pages?
Well, it was a bit like that. It was now coming into system knowledge and expertise throughout our, you know, our wonderful network that we have within the service to cope with these situations. And if I can say, the training of all concerned in the within the flying doctor service and of course the onboard team as well.
Yeah, you were lucky that you weren't on your own. It could have been a different ending.
Well, not just that. I was also lucky, I guess, that I had someone as diligent as Steve that was...
Who'd been through it before.
Well, I guess so, but someone, you know, pulling up the floor and things like that wasn't an easy task. It probably took a good 20 or 25 minutes just to perform that, and then with the myriad of electrical and mechanical and equipment that's under the floor, then to follow and locate the components that Steve had to do, and the communications, it was a terrific team performance all around.
Patient and passenger are okay, all's well ended well.
That's exactly right. And Steve, could I just say that we did work as a team, but a lot's been made of this, which I think is probably wrong in a way, because it's only what other people would have done in the same situation. It's all about teamwork and about training.
Well, fair enough, but if I was wearing a hat, I'd still take it off to all of you. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Steve, if I could just add, if I've got a second, the New South Wales section of Broken Hill lost a very important member of their team recently, a very important engineer, and I think when we talk about teamwork, perhaps we had a little bit of assistance there with our past member, and perhaps Rod McArdle helped us out during that effort on Saturday night.
Terrific. Good on you guys. Thanks for talking.
Thanks, Steve.
Much.
Captain Tim Fletcher and Stephen Miller in Launceston. And coming up after the break, the faceless stars of Star Wars.
Still to come.
The releases for 1997 was made 20 years ago and generated more interest the second time around than the first. I'm talking, of course, about George Lucas's epic Star Wars series. Two of the stars of the trilogy can safely walk the streets without being mobbed by autograph hounds because we never actually saw their faces. Kenny Baker played the cheeky droid R2-D2, while Jeremy Bulloch played the mean bounty hunter. They're both in Australia for a Star Wars convention and they join us in Melbourne. Good morning to both of you.
Morning.
Good morning.
Jeremy, can I start with you? Can you believe that Star Wars is, I mean, you're still doing promotional tours for this movie 20 years after it was made?
Yes, I mean, since the re-release, certainly at the end of February in America, Kenny and I and Peter Mayhew, Chewbacca, Darth Vader, we've been backwards and forwards to America because people have asked us to go along when the films have opened. And I can't believe, I think there's a bigger popularity this time round, new generation of fans. It's quite incredible, really.
Kenny, do you think you know what it is that's made Star Wars such a phenomenal success?
I don't really know, but I imagine it's all the little characters, all the little things that go along in the background that help, like a Disney film. And also there's a good story, a good storyline.
Well, you played R2-D2, who was one of my favourites. Let's have a look at R2-D2 at work.
R2, where are we going? I couldn't possibly, Joe. Come on.
Let's go, and don't forget the droids. We're on our way.
Phew, you made it alive.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Was it a challenge? Is it a challenge to try and give a robot character? I mean, what did you do? What tricks?
Well, I didn't do any tricks exactly, but I was inside the robot, obviously, and had to move it. I just had to make it come to life. I stood up inside. I had a little child's car seat inside. And when I stood up, the robot came up with me. And then I could move it that way, and I could move it that way, and I could say yes and no, and I could move the head round like that.
You just beheaded yourself.
It's just fallen down.
It's just disintegrated on the floor. Anyway,
and is it true that you got the job because you were the shortest person who auditioned?
Well, I think that must have been the only reason, really. It wasn't my acting ability. I just walked into the room, and George Lucas saw me and said, "Yep, he'll do," and that was it.
Now, Jeremy, Boba Fett, he was a bit of a bad guy, wasn't he?
Yes, he's a bad guy, but he's, in a way, a sort of nice bad guy. I mean, I've actually spoken at a university once, as I went to Boston 2 years ago, as all the students' favourite character. And they say, but there's a nice thing about him. And I feel that in some of his distant past, he probably fought with Han Solo, Harrison Ford, and something went wrong, so he went on the bad side. But he's a bit of a bandit, really.
Well, let's have a look at Boba.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on, buddy? You're being put into carbon freeze.
What if he doesn't survive? He's worth a lot to me.
The Empire will compensate you if he dies. Put him in.
No, stop! Stop! What are you doing? Get stop! Kill me! Yes, stop, please! I'm not ready to die!
Hey! Listen to me! Chewie! Chewie, this won't help me! Hey! Save your strength. There'll be another time.
I have to say, I never get tired of looking at the film. Do you?
No, I don't. I mean, I saw the Star Wars recently for the first time in 15 years, and the new little bits that George Lucas has put in do work, and you keep wanting to see bits again. I mean, I hope you were frightened by that sequence, Tracy.
Oh, absolutely terrifying.
Very menacing, wasn't it?
It was pretty menacing 20 years ago. Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher were quoted back at the original release of the film as they were having a bit of a go at George Lucas's scripting, and Harrison Ford said he only wrote those lines because he didn't have to say them. Was that a running gag on the set?
Well, yes, I think it was. I think it was, yes. I mean, 20 years ago, I don't think people thought it was going to be as popular as it's turned out to be. People might say, well, some of the dialogue is not really 1997. I think the film works because, as Kenny said earlier, there's a story there and there are characters that you actually care about. I think that's important to know.
Well, filming starts soon on Star Wars 4, which is, it would seem a bit of a risk, isn't it, given that they've been such legendary productions. If you go back to the scene of the crime, you better make it good, hadn't you?
It is a risk. I think it is a risk, but I think with the re-release and the interest is there. I think George Lucas has seen now how many people want to see, and everyone's now waiting for the new film. Kenny and I are asked the question time and time again, what happens in the new films? None of us know. I mean, we just don't know what's going to happen.
It's Star Wars 1, actually. We've done 4, 5 and 6, and now we're going back to 1.
Back to the very beginning.
And then possibly 2 and 3.
Will you be in it?
I'm hoping to be, yes. In fact, I'm almost sure I'll be in the first one anyway. I'm going to Tunisia in July, back to the scene of the crime, as it were.
And you, Jeremy?
And this is the robot, by the way, the
Actually, I don't know. Maybe you will see something of Boba Fett in one of the films, but to see what his past is like. But at the moment, I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
This is the 2-legged.
It's a pleasure.
Enjoy your stay.
It's far more realistic.
I'm not in the 3-legged version.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Kenny Baker and Jeremy Bulloch in Melbourne. The news and weather is next, and then penguins on parade and why these flightless birds could be in danger.